You were once somebody's wife, now you're nobody at all. Your husband's body lies wrapped in linen, the embalming process just beginning. The priests have ushered you out of the preparation room, but not before you glimpsed his still face one last time. You've cried until your eyes burn, screamed until your throat feels like sandpaper. But grief isn't your biggest problem now. Survival is. In ancient Egypt, becoming a widow wasn't just emotionally devastating, it was financial and social suicide. One day, you're a respected wife with a secure position. The next, you're damaged goods with empty hands and hungry children. Welcome to the brutally difficult world of the ancient Egyptian widow, where your husband's death is just the beginning of your problems. Tonight, we explore the forgotten women of the Nile, the shadows behind the glittering tombs and towering monuments. These aren't the queens whose golden death masks captivate museum visitors. These are ordinary women whose lives collapsed when their husbands stopped breathing. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if boring history helps you drift off to sleep. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always find it fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore these forgotten corners of history together. You might think widowhood was hard throughout ancient history, but in Egypt, it came with unique twists of cruelty. Women had certain legal rights in Egypt, more than in many ancient societies. Therefore, the fall from relative autonomy to widow status was particularly jarring. A widow often went from managing a household to begging for scraps, all within the span of a funeral. Picture yourself on the banks of the Nile 3,000 years ago. Your husband was a scribe of middling importance, not wealthy, but comfortable. He provided food, shelter, protection. Now he's gone, carried off by fever. But his brother is already eyeing your home. Therefore, you must decide quickly. Fight a legal battle you'll likely lose, or accept his offer of marriage to him. Your brother-in-law has always made your skin crawl. He has bad breath and wandering hands, but he has a roof and food. Sleep seems impossible as you weigh your options on a reed mat that's no longer technically yours. Your children breathe softly nearby, unaware that their futures hang in the balance of your decision. Your mind drifts to the widow who lives by the market, the one everyone avoids, claiming she brings bad luck. The one with the hollow cheeks who trades small favors for barley. Is that your future? Unlike our modern dating apps where you swipe right for a new husband, though I imagine recently deceased spouse wouldn't make for an attractive profile feature, remarriage wasn't about attraction. It was about survival. Your value on the marriage market depreciated faster than a papyrus boat in crocodile-infested waters. The ancient Egyptians, who carefully prepared for the afterlife with elaborate tombs and treasures, somehow forgot to create a decent safety net for the women left behind. They built pyramids that have lasted millennia, but couldn't build social structures to protect their most vulnerable. You'd think a civilization obsessed with death would have better planned for its aftermath. Egyptian art shows husbands and wives in tender embraces, suggesting romantic love existed. Imagine that. Finding true companionship, only to have it ripped away, replaced not just with grief, but with societal rejection. It's like being fired from your job, evicted from your home, and dumped by your friends, all on the day of your loved one's funeral. Talk about kicking a woman when she's down. Some widows did manage to navigate this brutal transition. Some found power in unlikely places. Some even thrived. But they were the exceptions that proved the rule. Most descended into poverty, obscurity, or marriages of desperate convenience. Tonight, we'll walk in their sandals. We'll feel the Egyptian sun beating down on a woman who's just lost everything. We'll navigate the legal labyrinth that kept widows powerless. We'll discover the clever ways some women subverted the system and the price they paid when caught. The stories of these widows reveal more about ancient Egyptian society than any hieroglyphic inscription on a temple wall ever could. Because how a civilization treats its most vulnerable members, especially those who've just experienced profound loss, tells us everything about its true values. So dim the lights, get comfortable, And let's travel back to a time when losing your husband meant losing your place in the world. When a woman could go from respected wife to social outcast between sunrise and sunset. When becoming a widow didn't just break your heart, it shattered your entire existence. These forgotten women of the Nile deserve to have their stories told. Even if those stories might keep you awake tonight, wondering how many widows' tears helped build those perfect pyramids we so admire. The sky is still dark when the fever finally takes him. Your husband's breathing, ragged for days, simply stops. One moment he's there, laboring for each breath. The next, he's gone. Just like that, you've been transformed, not just into a grieving spouse, but into something else entirely, a widow in ancient Egypt. Your life as you knew it just ended too. You don't get to process this quietly. The wailing begins immediately. Not just yours, though your chest feels like it's being crushed by invisible stones. Professional mourners must be summoned. Grief in ancient Egypt isn't private. It's performative, public, and painfully loud. Your personal heartbreak becomes community theater. Your sister-in-law arrives first, already coating her face with dust. Her eyes show genuine sadness, but her quick glances around the room betray other concerns. Therefore, you realize she's already mentally cataloging your belongings. Your husband's body isn't even cold, and the calculations have begun. Who gets what? Where will you go? What happens to the children? Women from neighboring houses stream in, bringing linen strips for bandaging. They avoid meeting your eyes directly, as if widowhood might be contagious, like your husband's fever. You've seen this before, how widows become walking reminders of mortality. Nobody wants that bad juju rubbing off on them. Social distancing, it seems, wasn't invented during modern pandemics after all. The men arrive to take your husband's body for washing. You're expected to kiss him one last time, but you hesitate, remembering the illness that took him. Therefore, everyone watches you closely, judging your devotion against your fear. A no-win situation, the first of many to come. You kiss his forehead. It's already cooling. Your mind races with practical matters, while you're supposed to be focused on spiritual ones. While the embalmer discusses preservation options that you definitely cannot afford, the deluxe mummification package is seriously outside your budget. You're calculating how many days of food remain in your storage jars. Spoiler alert, not enough. The village elder approaches with practiced sympathy. He places a hand on your shoulder. You'll be taken care of, he assures you. But his definition of care means your husband's brother making decisions about your future. Therefore, your momentary relief collapses like a poorly constructed pyramid. Children huddle in the corner, confused and frightened. Your oldest son, barely 8, suddenly stands straighter. Someone has whispered to him that he's the man of the house now. The absurdity would make you laugh if you weren't drowning in grief. He's a child who still needs his mother to cut his meat. Now he's supposed to be your protector. In reality, neither of you has any power at all. The funeral preparations consume the next 70 hours. You move through them like you're walking underwater. Rituals must be observed. Prayers must be chanted. Your husband's body must be prepared for its journey to the afterlife. Meanwhile, your journey into social oblivion has already begun. You're instructed not to bathe. Your hair remains uncombed. You wear only rough linen, while your husband gets cleaned, anointed, and wrapped in fine cloth. You must look as terrible as you feel. Ancient Egyptian grief protocols don't include self-care routines or scented bath oils. The message is clear. Part of you has died too. Women bring food you cannot eat. Your appetite vanished with your husband's last breath. They remind you to keep up your strength, but their eyes say you'll need it for the hardships ahead. Therefore, you force down bread that tastes like sand, sipping beer that doesn't dull the pain one bit. Your mother-in-law weeps louder than anyone. Between sobs, she manages to mention 3 times that her son built this house. The implication hangs in the air like heavy incense. This home isn't truly yours, never was. Your security was always an illusion, thin as papyrus and just as easily torn. On the day of burial, you walk behind the procession. Dust coats your feet, your ankles, your grief-weakened knees. The professional mourners earn their keep, tearing at their clothes and shrieking toward the heavens. You find yourself resenting their performance. Their grief ends when the payment does. Yours stretches toward a horizon you can't yet see. At the tomb, a simple cut in the rock, not the elaborate painted chambers of nobles. The priests perform final rites. Your husband's worldly possessions are minimal, but tradition demands some go with him to the afterlife. Therefore, you watch as items you might have sold for food are placed alongside his wrapped body. The small copper mirror, the wooden headrest, his favorite drinking cup. The local scribe who never acknowledged you when your husband was alive suddenly appears solicitous. He offers to help manage affairs, his eyes not quite meeting yours. You've heard about this before. Men who prey on new widows, offering assistance while helping themselves to whatever remains. The vultures don't all have feathers. Some carry writing palettes and calculators. As the burial concludes, reality crashes down like the ceiling of a poorly maintained tomb. Yesterday, you were someone's wife. Today, you're a problem to be solved, a burden to be distributed. Your identity has been wrapped and buried alongside your husband. Back at the house, which may not be yours much longer, relatives linger. Their conversation shifts from remembrances to practical matters with alarming speed. Who will take the oldest boy as an apprentice? Perhaps your husband's cousin needs help with his farming. That would be one less mouth for you to feed. How thoughtful of them to start dividing your family before the burial herbs have even dried. Night falls. The visitors finally leave. Your children sleep, exhausted by emotions they lack words to express. You sit alone in the darkened main room, the oil lamp burning low. Tomorrow begins your first full day as a widow, no longer protected by marriage, no longer defined by your husband's position, just a woman alone in a society built for couples. Your tears fall silently now. The public performance of grief has ended, but your private anguish has only begun. Therefore, you allow yourself this one night of weakness before the real struggle begins. Tomorrow you'll need every scrap of strength to navigate your new reality. You catch your reflection in a water basin. The face that looks back is already different, harder, older, marked not just by sorrow, but by the sudden weight of uncertainty. You recognize this expression. You've seen it on other women's faces after their husbands died. Now you understand what they knew. That death takes more than just the person who stops breathing. In just one day, you've become invisible and hypervisible simultaneously. No longer someone's cherished wife, but a walking reminder of fate's cruelty. People will either look right through you or stare too long, wondering when misfortune will visit their household too. The lamp flickers, nearly out of oil. Like your former life, its light is fading. You don't replenish it. Better to practice sitting in darkness. After all, that's where Egyptian society has just placed you, in the shadows, on the margins, away from the light of privilege and protection that marriage once provided. Not dead, but no longer fully alive in the eyes of your community. This is just the first sunset of your new existence. There will be countless more, each one marking another day of struggle in a world that has no designated place for a woman without a man. The journey ahead will require more strength than grief allows you to imagine right now. But somewhere beneath your tears, that strength is already taking root. It has to. In ancient Egypt, a widow's only choices are to adapt or to perish. Many do both. Morning breaks, harsh and unforgiving. The economic reality of widowhood rises with the sun. Your tears have barely dried, but the mathematics of survival already demand attention. Therefore, you begin counting. Grain jars, copper pieces, days until the next harvest. It's a grim calculation. The answer is always not enough. Property in ancient Egypt wasn't just about wealth. It was about existence itself. Your husband's death hasn't just created an empty space in your bed. It's created a void in your legal standing. The home you've lived in for years, technically not yours. The fields that fed your family, someone else's now. The tools, the furniture, the future you planned, all suddenly in question. Marriage in ancient Egypt was essentially an economic arrangement with romantic benefits on the side. Death voided that contract faster than a modern-day streaming service cancels your favorite show after one season. Now you're facing the ancient Egyptian version of extreme financial insecurity, only without unemployment benefits or a GoFundMe option. Most widows discovered a brutal truth. Inheritance laws weren't designed with them in mind. In theory, Egyptian women had certain rights, but in practice, those rights crumbled like sun-dried mud bricks when challenged. Therefore, you find yourself navigating a legal labyrinth with no map and diminishing resources. The game was rigged before you even started playing. Your oldest son should inherit the bulk of your husband's possessions, not you. You're merely the caretaker until he comes of age. If you don't have sons, well, that's unfortunate. Your husband's brother or male relatives will happily step in to manage everything. By manage, they mean take. The language of inheritance has always been creative with euphemisms. You remember that widow from the village's northern edge? She lost everything within a moon cycle of her husband's death. His family descended like locusts, stripping away possessions with ruthless efficiency. She now sits by the marketplace, grinding grain for wealthier households. Her back permanently bent, her hands perpetually raw. Is this your future too? The economic models for widows were painfully limited. Option 1, remarry quickly. Option 2, be absorbed into your husband's family as essentially unpaid labor. Option 3, try to survive independently in a system designed to make that nearly impossible. It's like choosing between drowning, burning, or very slow starvation. Decision fatigue was the least of your problems. Wealth offered some protection, of course. Rich widows had better options. But even they weren't immune to predatory relatives and opportunistic officials. Therefore, the widow of a merchant might keep her home while losing control of the business that sustained it. Golden chains are still chains. In the rare cases where a woman inherited substantial property directly, the vultures circled with particular enthusiasm. Male relatives challenged documents, officials discovered unpaid taxes. Priests suddenly remembered religious obligations the deceased had supposedly promised. Convenient memories, all of them. Their timing as predictable as Nile flooding. The common widow faced starker choices. Your skill set, developed over years of marriage, suddenly needed monetization. Could you weave fine enough linen to sell? Brew beer that people would buy? Provide services as a midwife or mourner? Your value was now calculated in the most direct terms. What can you produce that someone will pay for? Children complicated the economic equation exponentially. More mouths meant more food needed, but more hands could potentially generate more income. Therefore, many widows faced impossible choices about which children to keep with them and which to send away as servants or apprentices. The mathematics of maternal heartbreak has remained consistent across millennia. Survival often meant deploying your only remaining asset, your labor. Dawn until dusk, grinding grain for wealthier households, washing linens until your hands cracked and bled, becoming essentially what we'd now call the gig economy worker of ancient Egypt, except without the luxury of complaining about it on social media. The Egyptian elite occasionally established systems to support widows, at least on papyrus. Temples might provide food allocations. Officials sometimes intervened if injustice became too blatant. These safety nets, however, were as reliable as a sandal made of papyrus during flood season. They looked functional until you actually needed to depend on them. Some widows found economic refuge in temples. Religious institutions needed workers, and widows needed security. It wasn't charity, it was a transaction. Your labor in exchange for basic sustenance, not unlike modern minimum wage jobs, except with more incense and fewer health violations. The clever widow, if she had sufficient resources to begin with, might find creative solutions. Some became informal moneylenders, extending small loans of grain or goods to neighbors. Others acted as agents for larger businesses, taking a percentage of transactions. Entrepreneurship existed even then, though without the inspirational LinkedIn posts about hustle culture. Records show occasional success stories. The widow who maintained her husband's workshop by employing skilled craftsmen. The one who expanded a small weaving operation into a profitable enterprise. These women were exceptions that proved the rule. Their successes were notable precisely because they were so rare. For most, economic survival meant dependence on family, on temple charity, on the reluctant generosity of neighbors. Your status plummeted faster than a lead weight in the Nile. Yesterday, a respected wife, today essentially a beggar. The economic ladder had fewer rungs for women, and widows started at the bottom. The ultimate economic truth: ancient Egyptian society simply wasn't structured for women's financial independence. Marriage wasn't just a romantic partnership, it was economic life support. When that support vanished, most women faced financial cardiac arrest. No safety nets, no second chances, no recovery plans. Consider the ritual offerings left in Egyptian tombs: food, furniture, tools, clothing. The dead were better provided for than many living widows. At least the deceased had guaranteed meals in the afterlife. Your next meal remained an open question. Perhaps there's dark humor in realizing the dead had better economic security than you now do. Some widows banded together, pooling meager resources to create micro-communities of survival. 3 or 4 sharing a small dwelling, combining skills and labor to eke out existence. Ancient Egypt's version of roommates splitting the rent, except instead of arguing over who ate the last slice of pizza, they debated which child would eat that day. Your value in the marriage market, should you choose that path, depreciated with each passing day. Younger women commanded better bride prices. Widows with children were economic liabilities. Your options narrowed faster than the Nile Valley approaching the Delta. This wasn't dating. This was desperate economic calculation. Night falls on your first full day of widowhood. You've spent it taking inventory, both literal and metaphorical. What remains? What's been taken? What might you sell to buy another week of existence? The oil lamp flickers, dimmer now as you conserve precious fuel. Even light has become a luxury you can barely afford. Your neighbor, still safely married, brought a small loaf of bread when no one was looking. Her kindness came with a whispered warning. My husband says his brother plans to claim your storage jars tomorrow. No official inheritance process, no legal documents, just the raw assertion of male authority. But you've hidden one jar beneath the sleeping mats. Therefore your children will eat for a few more days at least. Small victories in a war you're destined to lose. Economic violence leaves no visible bruises. It doesn't spill blood across the floor, but it kills just as effectively as a knife. Therefore, you begin planning like a military strategist, identifying resources, anticipating attacks, calculating how to survive the next assault. Your battlefield is your former home. Your enemies wear familiar faces. When your husband drew his final breath, your economic life expectancy began its countdown. The question isn't if you'll lose everything, but when, and how much dignity you can preserve in the process. Perhaps that's why Egyptian art never depicts widows. They weren't just mourning, they were vanishing, economically, socially, systematically erased. The ancient Egyptians, who mapped the stars and built monuments that would stand for millennia, somehow never developed a blueprint for widow survival. They created elaborate systems to ensure eternal life after death, but left women economically dead while still breathing. The cosmic accounting simply didn't balance. You extinguish the lamp. Darkness is free, at least. Tomorrow brings another day of calculations, negotiations, and quiet desperation. You'll fight for every grain of barley, every copper piece, every scrap of economic dignity. Not because you expect to win, but because you have no choice. In the economic underworld of ancient Egypt, widows were the truly impoverished souls, not because they lacked wealth, but because the entire system was designed to drain whatever resources they had. While priests promised the dead eternal abundance in the field of reeds, widows faced perpetual scarcity in the land of the living. Perhaps the cruelest irony of all was that a society so obsessed with preparation for death had made so little provision for those left behind by it. The scribe won't look at you directly. His eyes remain fixed on the papyrus as he explains why you can't inherit your husband's workshop. Legal terms flow from his mouth like water from a broken jar, abundant, unstoppable, and making a mess of everything. You're drowning in a sea of regulations you never knew existed. Welcome to the legal labyrinth of widowhood in ancient Egypt, where the rules were written by men, for men, and about women as afterthoughts. In theory, Egyptian women enjoyed more legal rights than their contemporaries in neighboring civilizations. But theory rarely survived contact with reality. Therefore, what existed on papyrus seldom materialized in practice, especially for widows. Your legal personhood, never particularly robust to begin with, has just suffered a near-fatal blow with your husband's death. Legal documents from ancient Egypt reveal a system that recognized women's theoretical right to own property and represent themselves. However, these rights existed in a framework that assumed male guidance and protection. Consequently, when that male presence vanished, the entire legal structure became hostile territory for the woman navigating it alone. Think of it as ancient Egypt's version of fine print. You technically had rights until you actually needed to exercise them. Then suddenly there were conditions, exceptions, and procedural barriers that might as well have been written in hieroglyphs, which, come to think of it, they often literally were. Legal literacy wasn't exactly a common skill set among women who spent their lives managing households, rather than studying in scribal schools. The legal definition of widowhood wasn't just about marital status, it was about categorical diminishment. You're now legally adjacent to orphans, the elderly, and the disabled, all groups considered inherently vulnerable and in need of protection. It's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of being put on permanent parental controls when you're actually a fully functioning adult. For your own good, rarely meant for your actual benefit. Restrictions accumulated like sand in a sandal. You couldn't travel freely without male approval. Certain contracts required male co-signers. Some temples and public spaces became effectively off-limits. Your movement, your decisions, your very autonomy, all suddenly subject to oversight. It's like being demoted from manager to intern in your own life, except the performance review is conducted by your deceased husband's second cousin, whom you've met exactly twice. Legal proceedings became particularly treacherous terrain. A widow entering a court dispute faced scrutiny not just of her case, but of her character. Was she properly observing mourning customs? Was she appropriately deferential? Was she perhaps too educated or articulate for a woman in her position? The legal system might technically hear her plea while simultaneously judging her for having the audacity to make it. Court records occasionally mention widows bringing cases, usually regarding inheritance disputes. These women were exceptional, both in their knowledge and their courage. Most disputes never reached official channels. They were resolved through family pressure, community intervention, or simple intimidation. Justice wasn't blind in ancient Egypt. It had very clear vision when it came to gender and status. The absence of widows' voices in legal texts speaks volumes. When they do appear, they're usually spoken for or about, rarely speaking themselves. It's the ancient equivalent of being on permanent mute during a Zoom meeting where everyone else is deciding your future. You can see what's happening, but your input isn't exactly being solicited. Regional variations complicated matters further. Upper Egypt might follow different customary practices than the Delta. Urban centers operated differently than rural villages. The Old Kingdom had different approaches than the New Kingdom. Being a widow in Memphis might offer slightly more flexibility than in Thebes. It's like how modern divorce laws vary by state, except instead of hiring a lawyer in a more favorable jurisdiction, you'd need to pack everything you own and move your entire family to another province, assuming, of course, you were even allowed to relocate without permission. Legal changes across dynasties created another layer of confusion. What was permitted under one pharaoh might be restricted under another. Records from the Middle Kingdom suggest slightly more protections for widows than earlier periods. By the late period, foreign influences had introduced new complications. Imagine if traffic laws changed completely every time a new president was elected, but nobody bothered to announce the changes or post new signs. That's essentially what widows faced with each new dynasty. Even elite widows weren't immune to legal constraints, though their wealth provided some insulation. Royal widows operated under entirely different rules, sometimes more restrictive, sometimes more permissive, but always political. A queen's widowhood wasn't just a personal status. It was a matter of state importance. Her body, her fertility, her very existence became properties of the kingdom. At least commoner widows didn't have to worry about being married off to secure diplomatic alliances with neighboring territories. Small mercies. The clever widow learned to navigate these constraints by working through male relatives who might be sympathetic, a brother, an adult son, occasionally even a fair-minded brother-in-law. These men became legal proxies, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a VPN, allowing you to access rights that should have been yours directly. This approach required both social intelligence and luck. Not all widows had reliable male allies. Some legal documents show widows finding creative workarounds. A widow might establish a small business in her son's name while actually running it herself. Another might form a partnership with a male neighbor, creating mutual benefit through shared risk. These arrangements required extraordinary savvy and negotiation skills. Most widows lacked the education, resources, or connections to orchestrate such complex legal maneuvers. Religious law added yet another dimension. Certain obligations continued regardless of economic hardship. Offerings for your husband's kai, spirit, weren't optional. Temple tithes couldn't be ignored. The gods' demands didn't diminish just because your resources had. Divine law trumped human need every time. The afterlife economy took precedence over your actual living one, a prioritization system uniquely Egyptian in its absolutism. Your legal value was inextricably tied to reproductive status. Younger widows who might bear more children had different legal considerations than older women past childbearing age. A pregnant widow faced special legal complications regarding the unborn child's potential inheritance rights. Your womb wasn't just a biological organ, it was a legal entity with implications for property transfer, family obligation, and social positioning. Imagine your reproductive system having its own legal team. That's essentially how ancient Egyptian law viewed it. The most successful legal strategy for most widows was invisibility. Attract no attention, dispute nothing openly, accept visible losses to preserve hidden resources. It wasn't justice, but it was survival. Legal battles rarely favored the widow, so many chose not to fight at all. Sometimes the only winning move was not to play the game. As night falls on your third day of widowhood, you sit holding a small wooden figurine, your husband's favorite possession. According to the scribe, it legally belongs to your son now, but your son is only 6 years old. Therefore, you're temporarily maintaining it for him. These legal fictions become your armor, thin as papyrus, but necessary for dignity. You're learning to speak the language of legal technicalities, finding the gaps between written rules and practical enforcement. Tomorrow you'll face the temple administrators who claim your husband promised a donation he never mentioned to you. Another legal battle in a war you're ill-equipped to fight. You place the figurine carefully aside, wondering which laws you'll discover have been secretly governing your life all along. The legal system wasn't designed to protect you. It was designed to manage you, to keep you firmly within boundaries you never consented to. In the grand temples of Egypt, massive stone columns supported elaborate ceilings decorated with stars, creating an earthly reflection of divine order. But in the legal universe of ancient Egypt, widows existed in the architectural equivalent of a storage room, technically part of the structure, but deliberately placed where they would be neither seen nor heard. The laws of Egypt, like its monuments, were designed to last for eternity. The difference was that while those monuments celebrated pharaohs and gods, the legal system enshrined the principle that a woman without a husband was a problem to be contained rather than a person to be protected. Your husband is barely cold in his tomb when the first marriage proposal arrives. not delivered with flowers or romantic poetry, but through your brother-in-law's calculating stare across the evening meal. You'll need protection, he says, meaning himself. Ancient Egyptian widows faced a pressure more relentless than the desert sun. Remarry quickly or face social extinction. Your grief isn't even fully formed, but survival demands attention. Therefore, you find yourself evaluating marriage prospects while still wearing mourning clothes. This isn't dating. This is desperation with social approval. Ancient Egypt had no swiping right or meet cutes at the local beer house. For widows, remarriage was less about finding love and more about finding shelter from the storm of social and economic vulnerability. Think less romantic comedy and more disaster movie, where the only escape vehicle is another man. Family pressure came first and hardest. Your husband's brother has already mentioned marriage twice this week. He's not being subtle. The subtext is clear. He wants his brother's property, and you're essentially part of the inventory. For him, it's a package deal. Widow, children, house, farmland, all conveniently bundled together like the ancient Egyptian version of a subscription box you definitely didn't sign up for. Levirate marriage, where a widow marries her deceased husband's brother, wasn't just a personal arrangement. It was a social institution designed to keep property within the family line, but it rarely considered the widow's preferences. Therefore, you're facing the prospect of sharing a bed with a man you've only ever known as your husband's less impressive sibling. His table manners alone make you contemplate a life of solitude. The timeline for appropriate remarriage was cruelly compressed. While you're still struggling to sleep through the night without reaching for your husband's warmth, the community has already started its countdown. 3 months was considered restrained. 6 months raised eyebrows. A year, practically scandalous. Mourning had an expiration date, and it arrived far sooner than your actual grief subsided. Age factored heavily into remarriage calculations. At 25, you're considered still viable in the marriage market. If you were 45, you'd be practically invisible, perhaps a blessing in disguise. Younger widows faced more intense pressure, but had more options. Older widows found less pressure, but fewer possibilities. The ancient Egyptian marriage market operated on a brutally efficient supply and demand basis that would make modern economists wince with its ruthless clarity. Your mother offers unwelcome advice. At least his brother already knows the children. As if familiarity is the primary qualification for a stepfather, she means well. But her generation survived by compromising. Therefore, she can't imagine any other path for you. The intergenerational transmission of trauma disguised as practical wisdom, a tradition as old as the pyramids themselves. The stigma of remaining unmarried hung over widows like a shadow. An unattached woman represented disorder in a society obsessed with cosmic and social harmony. You weren't just single, you were a walking disruption to Ma'at, the fundamental balance of the universe. No pressure or anything, just cosmic disorder resting on your marriage status. The ancient Egyptians had a remarkable talent for making personal decisions feel like religious obligations. Some widows resisted, of course. Records mention women who managed estates independently, ran businesses, or supported themselves through specialized crafts. These exceptional cases were just that, exceptions. They required unusual circumstances, significant wealth, powerful family connections, specialized skills, or extraordinary courage. For the average widow, resistance meant isolation, poverty, and judgment, a trinity of hardships few could weather. The psychological burden of entering a new marriage while still grieving created a special kind of anguish. Imagine being expected to feel gratitude toward a man for rescuing you while your heart still belongs to someone else. It's the emotional equivalent of being asked to move into a new house while the old one is still burning. The architectural transition might be complete, but the smoke never quite leaves your clothes. Your neighbor, a widow for 3 years now, managed to avoid remarriage through a clever strategy. She became so utterly indispensable to her late husband's sister's household that they couldn't spare her for another marriage. Her position isn't ideal. She works constantly, but she answers to no husband. Therefore, she's considered both a cautionary tale and a quiet inspiration among local women. Success in ancient Egypt was often measured by which constraints you managed to avoid, rather than what freedoms you actually secured. Social events become minefields after widowhood. Every festival, every gathering becomes an awkward marriage market where you're simultaneously the product and the reluctant seller. Men who never glanced at you during your marriage suddenly discover your fascinating qualities. Their timing is as subtle as a hippopotamus in a lotus pond. Their interest in your well-being extends precisely to the boundaries of your remaining property, and not one cubit further. If you had daughters of marriageable age, the calculations became even more complex. Potential suitors sometimes had more interest in acquiring young stepdaughters than in the widow herself. These arrangements carried darker implications that everyone pretended not to notice. The protection remarriage offered sometimes came with its own dangers. Not all predators had the decency to wear crocodile skin to identify themselves. Priests and community elders often facilitated remarriage arrangements, adding religious and social pressure to family expectations. The gods favor new beginnings, they would say, conveniently ignoring your ongoing pain. Ancient Egyptian religion was remarkably flexible when it came to justifying social conventions. The gods apparently had very strong opinions about widows remaining unmarried, but mysteriously fewer concerns about exploitation and forced marriages. The practical aspects of remarriage negotiations would make modern prenuptial agreements look quaint by comparison. Who retains control of which assets? What obligations does the new husband have to the previous husband's children? What happens to offerings for the deceased's spirit? These weren't just financial discussions. They were negotiations about your very existence and identity. It's like planning a wedding where the seating chart includes not just living relatives, but also the demands of the dead and the unborn. For widows with sons, remarriage introduced complicated dynamics. Your son, technically the heir to his father's property, might view your new husband as a threat to his inheritance. Your new husband might view your son as an obstacle to complete control. You're caught in the middle, trying to protect one while appeasing the other. Ancient Egyptian family therapy consisted mainly of suppressing these tensions until they inevitably erupted over inheritance disputes. The quality of second marriages varied wildly. Some widows found genuine companionship and protection. Others endured marriages of grim convenience that made their previous lives seem idyllic by comparison. Without divorce options readily available to women, a poor second marriage could be a life sentence. It's like gambling for survival with permanence as the stakes. Las Vegas has nothing on the risk assessment skills of ancient Egyptian widows. Royal and elite widows faced their own version of remarriage pressure, though with political rather than economic motivations. A queen's remarriage could cement alliances, prevent power vacuums, or satisfy powerful factions. Her personal preferences ranked somewhere below state security and well above the comfort of her furniture in the priority list. At least commoner widows didn't have to worry about their remarriage triggering international incidents or dynastic warfare. Another small mercy in a world that offered few. Some women found creative alternatives to traditional remarriage. Serving in temples provided both status and security for widows of appropriate background. Others formed female-headed households, pooling resources with other single women to create sustainable living arrangements. These alternatives required both courage and community support. Most widows couldn't access such options. The path of least resistance, remarriage, remained the most common choice by necessity rather than preference. As the moon rises on your fourth night of widowhood, you sit alone, weighing impossible options. Your brother-in-law's proposal hangs in the air, unaccepted but not rejected. Another man, a merchant who knew your husband, has made inquiries through intermediaries. His house is larger, his business prosperous, but he has a reputation for cruelty towards servants. Therefore, you wonder which form of security might prove most dangerous in the end. You still dream of your husband nightly. In these dreams, he's whole and healthy, laughing as he was before illness claimed him. You wake reaching for his warmth, finding only empty linen and cold reality. How does one enter a new marriage with these ghosts still so present? Yet the community's patience has limits. The grace period for your grief shrinks daily. Soon, decisions must be made. Tomorrow, your husband's brother will expect an answer. Your children watch you with worried eyes, sensing the precariousness of your position. Whatever choice you make reshapes not just your future, but theirs as well. No pressure, just the entire trajectory of multiple lives hanging on your decision. And they say modern women have it hard trying to choose between swiping left or right. The ancient Egyptians, who meticulously prepared their dead for an ideal afterlife, complete with everything they might need for eternity, offered no such careful preparations for the living left behind. A widow stood at the intersection of past and future, carrying the weight of memory while facing a horizon shrouded in uncertainty. Perhaps the cruelest irony of remarriage wasn't that it came too soon after loss, but that it demanded women exchange the ghosts they loved for the strangers they needed. A transaction where the heart was always meant to lose while survival sometimes won. Your son wakes screaming from nightmares about his father. Your daughter refuses to eat. Your infant still nurses, oblivious to the catastrophe that has befallen your family. For widowed mothers in ancient Egypt, children weren't just mouths to feed. They were hearts to heal, while your own heart was still shattered. Motherhood after widowhood wasn't just parenting. It was parenting on the hardest difficulty setting with no instruction manual and depleted resources. You want to comfort your children properly, but grief has hollowed you out. Therefore, you perform a mother's duties like an actress in a temple play, going through motions while feeling detached from your own performance. The guilt of inadequate mothering compounds daily. Your children deserve better than this empty shell of the woman you were. But transformation takes time you don't have. Custody wasn't a guaranteed right for widowed mothers. It was a privilege contingent on circumstances and family dynamics. Your children technically belong to your husband's family lineage, not to you. However, removing them from your care created practical problems. Consequently, most children remained with their mothers unless significant property or political considerations were at stake. You're allowed to keep raising them, not because the system values maternal bonds, but because no one else wants the burden. The practical challenges of single motherhood in ancient Egypt would make modern single parents wince in recognition, then faint in horror at the additional complications. No daycare centers, no child support payments, no school systems to provide structure, just you, trying to both earn a living and raise children in a society that provided no infrastructure for that impossible dual role. It's like trying to build a pyramid with your bare hands while also composing poetry about the experience. Children's lives changed dramatically after their father's death. Sons lost not just a parent, but a career path. Your husband would have trained your son in his trade or profession, creating continuity across generations. Now that future has vanished. Your 8-year-old, who once dreamed of becoming a scribe like his father, faces the prospect of unskilled labor or military service. Aspirations crumble faster than mud bricks in the flood season. Daughters faced different challenges. Your 12-year-old's marriage prospects diminish with each passing day of your financial decline. The dowry you once planned to provide shrinks as resources dwindle. She watches you with wary eyes, absorbing hard lessons about female vulnerability. You hate that she's learning these truths so young. But perhaps forewarned is forearmed in a world so brutally tilted against women. Extended family played complex roles in raising fatherless children. Some relatives genuinely helped from familial devotion. Others viewed your children as potential labor or political assets. Your husband's cousin has offered to take your eldest son as an apprentice. His kindness seems genuine, but his workshop is in another village. Therefore, you face losing daily contact with your child in exchange for his economic future, another impossible choice on the growing pile. The Egyptian social structure provided no formal support systems for widowed mothers. No state stipends, no widows' pensions, no social services. The temple might occasionally distribute grain to the worthy poor, a category that included widows with children. This charity came with expectations of appropriate gratitude and religious observance. Think of it as ancient Egypt's version of a bureaucratic assistance program, but with more incense and fewer forms to fill out. Pregnant widows faced particularly precarious circumstances. Carrying a child who would never know its father created both practical and spiritual dilemmas. Who would perform the naming ceremony traditionally conducted by fathers? Who would teach a son the family trade or secure a daughter's marriage? Pregnancy and widowhood wasn't just about bringing new life into the world. It was about bringing it into a world with a gaping absence at its center. The gender of children created different challenges for widowed mothers. Sons could eventually provide economic support, but they also required years of investment before reaching productive age. Therefore, each male child represented both future security and present burden. Daughters might help with household duties sooner, but their eventual marriages meant losing their labor and contributions. It's like investing in a retirement plan that might either pay off handsomely or completely collapse, with no way to diversify your portfolio. A widow's responsibility to preserve her husband's legacy through children added another layer of pressure to already overwhelmed mothers. Children weren't just people to raise, they were living memorials. Your son must learn the prayers to offer for his father's car. Your daughter must remember the family stories to pass down. You must somehow instill reverence for a father some of them barely knew. No pressure, just the eternal spiritual well-being of your deceased husband resting on your parenting skills. The physical toll of solo parenting in ancient Egypt defies modern comprehension. Carrying water, grinding grain, cooking meals, mending clothes, all while supervising children and possibly working for income. No appliances, no convenience foods, no babysitters on call. The phrase, "I don't know how she does it," wasn't just a casual compliment to widowed mothers. It was a literal acknowledgement of seemingly superhuman endurance. The ancient Egyptian version of a fitness challenge wasn't running a marathon. It was raising 3 children alone while maintaining a household without running water. Children of widows often entered the workforce earlier than their peers. Your 6-year-old helps gather grain after harvest. Your 10-year-old assists a neighbor with animal tending in exchange for milk. Childhood truncates when survival demands it. You watch their small hands perform adult tasks and mourn the lost innocence along with your lost husband. The relationship between widowed mothers and adult children could provide rare security if a son achieved economic stability. But adult daughters who married joined their husbands' households. Therefore, investing equally in all children rarely yielded equal returns in old age. Parents aren't supposed to calculate returns on investment for loving their children, but hunger has a way of making mathematicians of us all. Some widowed mothers found creative solutions for child-rearing challenges. Records mention informal childcare cooperatives where widows took turns watching children while others worked. Temple schools occasionally accepted fatherless boys with demonstrated potential. Community grandmothers sometimes stepped in to mind young children. These arrangements weren't systematic. They were fragile improvisations, dependent on goodwill and circumstance. The psychological burden of raising children while processing your own grief created a uniquely painful dynamic. Children needed emotional reassurance you could barely provide. They asked questions about death you couldn't answer. They expressed anger you secretly shared but couldn't validate. Parenting through grief is like trying to navigate a ship through a storm while also bailing water and comforting terrified passengers, all while fighting your own seasickness. As your 5th night of widowhood ends, you lie awake listening to your children's breathing in the darkness. Your youngest whimpers in his sleep. You reach out to stroke his hair, this small person who carries half of your husband in his face. Tomorrow brings more challenges. Your brother-in-law's continued pressure about remarriage, dwindling food supplies, your daughter's increasing withdrawal. But these sleeping children are your anchor. Therefore, you find strength you didn't know you possessed, reserves deeper than the deepest well in the driest season. Your mother once told you that children were a blessing from the gods. No one mentioned they could also be the only reason to continue when everything else crumbled. Their needs force you out of bed each morning. Their faces give purpose to your struggle. In their eyes, you're still someone, not just a widow, but their mother. It's not enough to rebuild your shattered world, but it's a foundation stone. As the first light of dawn filters through the window, you make a silent promise to these vulnerable sleepers. Whatever happens, remarriage, poverty, relocation, you will fight to keep them together. Not because you're heroic or special, but because you're all they have left. And somehow, against all logic and evidence, they still believe you can protect them. You won't tell them otherwise. Some illusions are worth preserving, even in a world that has already stolen so much. In the annals of ancient Egypt, great kings built monuments to ensure their names would live forever. But in the quiet corners of ordinary homes, widowed mothers built something far more resilient, though completely unrecorded by history. They raised children who survived despite impossible odds, who remembered their fathers' names when no pyramid marked their resting places, who carried forward bloodlines that would otherwise have vanished like footprints in desert sand. No hieroglyphics commemorated these achievements. No temple walls recorded these victories. Yet in the unyielding mathematics of human survival, these nameless women's accomplishments may have been the most monumental of all. The market women fall silent as you approach. Conversations halt mid-sentence. Eyes dart away from yours, as if your gaze might contaminate them. You've become a walking embodiment of death, a bad omen on sandals. Welcome to the social stigma of widowhood in ancient Egypt, where superstition transformed grieving women from objects of sympathy into sources of supernatural danger. Your tragedy isn't just personal anymore, it's now considered contagious. You desperately need community support, but your very presence makes others uncomfortable. Therefore, you find yourself increasingly isolated precisely when connection matters most. The bitter irony isn't lost on you. When your husband was alive, these same women visited your home, shared meals at your table. Now they treat you like you're carrying plague rather than grief. Death has marked you, not just emotionally, but socially. The Egyptians, despite their elaborate preparation for the afterlife, harbored deep fears about death's contaminating influence on the living. However, someone had to handle practical matters related to death. Consequently, widows became walking reminders of mortality that both repelled and fascinated their communities. You're essentially the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a horror movie that everyone's afraid to watch, but can't stop peeking at through their fingers. Beliefs about widows being unlucky or cursed permeated daily interactions. A farmer might avoid selling to you directly, fearing your touch might affect his future harvests. A pregnant woman might cross to the other side of the street, protecting her unborn child from your presumed negative energy. Children were sometimes pulled away from your path, as if widowhood might be transmitted like a cough. The ancient Egyptians had no concept of germ theory, but they definitely pioneered social distancing when it came to the recently bereaved. Rituals designed to cleanse widows of death's association were often uncomfortable and occasionally humiliating. Special bathing ceremonies, fumigation with specific herbs, temporary isolation periods. These weren't designed for your benefit, they were to make everyone else feel safe around you again. It's the ancient Egyptian version of being forced to use hand sanitizer before entering a building, except the sanitizer is made from questionable ingredients, and you have to apply it in front of an audience. In public spaces, your widowhood announced itself before you even spoke. Specific mourning clothes marked you visibly. Your hair, previously styled according to the latest fashion, now remained unbound or covered completely. Cosmetics, once an essential part of Egyptian self-presentation, became forbidden during deep mourning. You're essentially wearing a neon sign that says, "Recently traumatized. Proceed with caution," in hieroglyphics. Dress codes for widows served practical and symbolic purposes. The distinctive appearance allowed others to adapt their behavior appropriately, offering condolences or avoiding taboo subjects. But these visible markers also enabled avoidance and discrimination. Therefore, your identity became reduced to your loss, visible from across the marketplace. Who needs dating app profiles when your entire life story is written in your hemline and hairstyle? Social isolation wasn't just emotional discomfort, it had practical consequences. Who would help with your leaking roof? Who would assist with the heavy lifting at your home? Tasks that relied on community reciprocity became nearly impossible when people avoided your home. The superstitions surrounding widowhood created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Widows struggled because people expected them to struggle, and then withheld the very support that might have prevented it. The perception of widows as dangerous or threatening to social order wasn't completely unfounded from the patriarchal perspective. A woman without male oversight represented unpredictability in a society obsessed with order. Would she behave appropriately? Would she observe proper boundaries? Would she, most terrifying of all, demonstrate that women could survive without men? Your mere existence raises uncomfortable questions about gender dependency. No wonder they want to keep you at arm's length. Interestingly, widows sometimes leveraged these superstitions to carve out unusual freedoms. If people already avoid you, why not speak your mind more freely? If your touch is considered dangerous, perhaps fewer men will harass you. Some widows leaned into their fearsome reputations, finding a strange power in being dreaded rather than desired. When life gives you cursed lemons, make intimidating lemonade. Regional variations in superstitions created confusing standards for widows who relocated after their husband's death. In Upper Egypt, widows might be forbidden from handling certain foods. In the Delta, different taboos applied. Moving from one community to another meant learning an entirely new set of supernatural restrictions. The ancient Egyptian equivalent of trying to figure out which app works for food delivery in a new city, except the stakes involved your social acceptance rather than convenience. Time gradually diminished the supernatural taint of widowhood. After a year or two, most widows transitioned from actively dangerous to merely somewhat unfortunate in community perception. But the stigma never completely disappeared. Therefore, even decades later, your widowhood might be referenced as explanation for random misfortunes. Crop failure. Perhaps that widow's curse lingered longer than expected. Unexpected illness. Remember when she attended the harvest festival years ago? The ancient Egyptians invented many things, but correlation does not imply causation wasn't among them. Some particularly cruel superstitions suggested that widows whose husbands died suddenly or violently might have somehow caused the death through spiritual failings or secret transgressions. This added blame to already overwhelming grief. You're not just mourning, you're defending yourself against unspoken accusations. It's like experiencing the world's worst breakup, while simultaneously being suspected of causing it through negative vibes. Curiously, widows were sometimes attributed special spiritual powers precisely because of their proximity to death. Some were believed to have enhanced abilities to communicate with the deceased or interpret omens. This created a contradictory status: feared yet occasionally consulted, avoided yet sometimes sought out for specific knowledge. Human societies excel at creating complicated social categories, but ancient Egypt truly perfected the art of simultaneous reverence and revulsion. Professional mourners, often widows themselves, inhabited a unique social position. Their ritual wailing and expressions of grief were considered necessary for proper funerals, but their association with death made them perpetually suspect. Therefore, they existed in a liminal social space, essential yet marginalized, paid for services yet socially isolated. It's perhaps history's first example of essential workers being simultaneously required and stigmatized, a tradition that unfortunately continues into modern times. Your neighbor's child falls ill the same week you return to the marketplace. Whispers begin immediately. No one accuses you directly. That would be impolite, but the timing is considered interesting. Never mind that half the children in the village have similar symptoms. Your presence provides a convenient supernatural explanation more satisfying than random chance. Humans have always preferred narrative causality to statistical probability, even when those narratives harm innocent people. The most painful aspect of these superstitions is how they compound isolation when connection is most needed. Grief already separates you from others. The gap between those who understand loss and those who don't creates a chasm wider than the Nile. Add supernatural fear, and that gap becomes virtually uncrossable. You find yourself on an island of pain, visible to all, yet untouchable. Some widows internalize these superstitions, beginning to wonder if they truly did carry some cursed essence. Did your husband die because of some failing on your part? Are you somehow dangerous to those you love? Grief distorts thinking even without external reinforcement. With an entire society suggesting your negative spiritual influence, maintaining rational perspective becomes nearly impossible. The greatest triumph of patriarchal superstition isn't controlling widows' behavior. It's making widows doubt themselves. As you prepare for bed on your 6th night of widowhood, you notice your remaining milk has soured. Normally, you'd see this as a result of hot weather. But now you wonder, is it because of you? Therefore, you find yourself performing a small protective ritual you've seen other widows do, despite telling yourself it's foolish. The superstitions have begun their invasion of your thinking, subtle but persistent. Your daughter mentions that her friend isn't allowed to visit anymore. The girl's mother fears your household is touched by death. You want to rage against this cruelty, but what would that accomplish? Instead, you tell your daughter that people fear what they don't understand. You don't add that someday, these same people might need compassion during their own inevitable losses. That lesson will come to them without your help. In the dark, these superstitions feel almost tangible. Shadows with substance, whispers with weight. By daylight, you can sometimes dismiss them as ignorance. But in a world where the supernatural permeates every aspect of life, separating rational thought from cultural conditioning becomes almost impossible. You find yourself both rejecting and observing taboos, both dismissing and fearing your own supposed power. It's cognitive dissonance wrapped in linen and scented with protective herbs. The ancient Egyptians, who mapped the movements of stars with astonishing precision and engineered structures that have lasted millennia, remained imprisoned by superstitions that transformed life's most vulnerable survivors into its most feared outcasts. Perhaps the most remarkable magic in Egypt wasn't found in papyrus spells or temple rituals, but in the widows who somehow maintained their humanity despite being treated as something less and something more than human. Women who carried the weight of both natural grief and supernatural suspicion, yet still managed to walk upright through a society determined to see them crawl. The temple doorway looms before you, its massive stone frame dwarfing your figure. You hesitate at the threshold. Before your husband's death, you entered freely to make offerings together. Now you're unsure if you're even permitted inside. Religion in ancient Egypt wasn't just spiritual practice, it was social architecture, defining who belonged where and how. For widows, this sacred geography shifted dramatically, creating new obligations while removing old privileges. The gods remained the same, but your relationship with them transformed overnight. Therefore, you approach divine spaces with new uncertainty, like a traveler without a map in familiar territory suddenly gone strange. Temple guards watch as you enter cautiously. Your mourning attire marks you clearly. One nods toward a side entrance, not the main hall, but a secondary space for those in states of ritual impurity. Death clings to you like invisible dust, making you temporarily unsuitable for certain sacred spaces. The ancient Egyptians had no concept of spiritual cuties, but if they did, widows would be considered highly contagious carriers. Religious obligations didn't diminish with widowhood, they multiplied. Your husband's ka, spirit, now depends entirely on your offerings for sustenance in the afterlife. Food, drink, prayers, remembrance, all must be provided regularly, or his eternal existence suffers. No pressure or anything, just the eternal comfort of your beloved soul resting entirely on your already overburdened shoulders. It's like being responsible for a high-maintenance pet that you can neither see nor touch, but that will supposedly suffer terribly if you forget its special food. The financial strain of these offerings creates impossible tensions. The bread placed at your husband's shrine means less in your children's bellies. But neglecting these offerings feels like betraying him all over again. Therefore, you reduce your own portions further, eating barely enough to maintain consciousness. The gods apparently appreciate sacrifice, though they seem curiously unconcerned with the literal starvation that might result from excessive devotion. Certain religious ceremonies now exclude you entirely. Fertility festivals, marriage celebrations, birth rituals. Your presence would bring unwelcome associations with death and loss. Other ceremonies suddenly require your participation. Ancestor worship, commemoration of the dead, funerary rites. Your newfound familiarity with death makes you an appropriate participant. It's the ancient Egyptian version of being uninvited from the wedding, but expected to show up for the funeral. Your social calendar has taken a decidedly morbid turn. The priests explain your new religious status with practiced detachment. You're now categorized differently in the cosmic order, not quite among the living, not yet among the dead, somewhere liminal, like the space between riverbank and water. This explanation is meant to be comforting. It isn't. Being told you occupy a spiritual DMZ between existence and non-existence doesn't exactly lift the spirits. The ancient Egyptians excelled at creating complex theological categories, but perhaps could have used some work on their bedside manner. Religious beliefs about widows' connections to the afterlife were contradictory and confusing. Some texts suggest widows had special access to the realm of the dead through their connection to departed husbands. Others imply widows required extra purification before approaching sacred spaces precisely because of this connection. However, no one seemed particularly interested in what widows themselves experienced or believed. Consequently, you perform rituals without fully understanding their meaning, following instructions rather than spiritual intuition. Religion becomes less about communion with the divine and more about following an increasingly complex set of rules. Temple positions sometimes became available to widows of appropriate status. These roles offered rare economic security and social respect, but competition was fierce, and connections mattered more than qualifications. Therefore, most widows could only dream of such opportunities while performing unpaid religious labor at home. It's like applying for an exclusive job where the main qualification is, must have experienced devastating personal loss and still not getting hired. The daily religious routines of a widow centered on maintaining connections between worlds. Dawn prayers to welcome Ra, midday offerings for the household gods, evening rituals for your husband's car. Between these sacred moments, you somehow managed cooking, cleaning, childcare, and income-generating work. The gods apparently didn't consider human limitations when designing devotional schedules. Their immortality perhaps made them somewhat insensitive to the constraints of mere mortals, juggling spiritual and practical responsibilities. Prayers specifically for widows existed in Egyptian religious texts, though they focus more on proper behavior than actual comfort. Pleas for patience, endurance, and acceptance of one's diminished status. Nothing about justice, restoration, or divine compensation for suffering. The message is clear. The gods expect you to bear your burden quietly, not demand that it be lightened. Divine help apparently comes in the form of increased capacity for suffering, rather than reduction of the suffering itself. Spiritual toxic positivity has apparently been around since the pyramids. Religious communities provided widows with social connections otherwise difficult to maintain. Weekly temple gatherings offered rare opportunities for interaction outside family structures. These communities could be supportive, but they also enforced conformity. Therefore, any widow seeking religious comfort had to carefully navigate between genuine devotion and performance of expected behaviors. It's the ancient Egyptian version of church coffee hour, simultaneously providing community and subjecting you to intense social scrutiny over your cake selection and conversation topics. Ancestor worship took on new dimensions for widows. Your husband transformed from partner to ancestor almost overnight. The man who once snored beside you, whose body you knew intimately, became a semi-divine figure requiring veneration. This spiritual cognitive dissonance created emotional whiplash. How do you properly worship someone when you also remember them forgetting to empty the chamber pot or burning the barley bread? Divinity is much easier to attribute to those you've never seen with bedhead. Spells and rituals specifically for widows promise protection from everything from economic hardship to malevolent spirits. Some widows spent precious resources on amulets and charms, desperate for any advantage in their precarious new reality. The market for widow-targeted spiritual solutions thrived on this desperation. Some things never change, whether it's ancient Egyptian protection spells or modern wellness products. Marketing to the vulnerable remains eternally profitable. The comfort religion provided to Egyptian widows was real, despite its complications. Faith offered explanations for otherwise senseless suffering. Rituals provided structure amid chaos. Beliefs about the afterlife suggested eventual reunion with loved ones. However, these same systems reinforced hierarchies that disadvantaged widows. Consequently, the spiritual comfort came packaged with social control. It's like being offered a healing balm that also contains a mild sedative, helpful for the pain, but suspiciously convenient for those who prefer you docile. As night falls on your 7th day of widowhood, you carefully arrange small offerings before the household shrine. A portion of bread, a cup of beer, a tiny pot of oil, all precious resources you can barely spare. You recite the prayers as taught, but add whispered words of your own. The official rituals feel insufficient to express what lies between you and the man now dwelling in the field of reeds. The gods may control the cosmic order, but they cannot dictate the contents of your heart. Your daughter watches from the doorway, learning these rituals by observation. She's memorizing not just the formal prayers, but the resigned set of your shoulders, the careful rationing of offerings, the way you navigate between devotion and practicality. She's learning what it means to be a widow in this world of gods and men. The religious education of Egyptian girls always included preparation for likely widowhood, though this was never explicitly acknowledged in the curriculum. Tomorrow brings the 7th day ceremony, when your husband's journey to the afterlife is considered complete. After that, your formal deep mourning transitions to a less restrictive but still marked status. Some religious prohibitions will lift, others will remain for months or years. The spiritual choreography of grief follows its own timeline, indifferent to whether your heart keeps pace. You finish the evening prayers with a familiar ache in your chest. Part of you still expects to turn and find him there, waiting to perform his portion of the household rituals. Instead, you find only empty space and responsibilities that have doubled while your resources have halved. Faith provides no material solutions to these practical problems, but it offers a framework for enduring them. Therefore, you cling to these rituals like a lifeline in the rushing river of uncertainty that widowhood has become. The ancient Egyptians created a religious system of extraordinary complexity and beauty, mapping spiritual landscapes with the same precision they used to chart the stars. Yet within this elaborate cosmic architecture, widows occupied a paradoxical position, burdened with increased religious responsibilities, while simultaneously restricted from full participation in sacred life. Perhaps the most profound spiritual practice Egyptian widows performed was one never recorded in any temple text: finding ways to maintain faith in gods who permitted such suffering while serving a society that compounded it. In this unwritten devotion, this daily balancing of cosmic obligation against human limitation, widows may have been Egypt's most dedicated theologians, creating meaning from the raw materials of loss. Your brother-in-law stands in the doorway of what was yesterday your bedroom. He measures the space with his eyes, already imagining his possessions replacing yours. "You can move to the back storage room," he announces, not asks. Housing for widows wasn't just about shelter, it was about visible demotion, spatial reinforcement of your new diminished status. The roof over your head remains, but your place beneath it has shrunk dramatically. Therefore, you begin the humiliating process of relocating your existence to increasingly marginal spaces, watching your physical world contract like the shadows at midday. Where widows lived after their husbands died depended largely on family dynamics, economic resources, and social standing. The ideal scenario, maintaining your own home, was rarely possible without significant independent wealth or adult sons to defend your claim. For most widows, housing options fell into a predictable and depressing hierarchy of dependency. It's like ancient Egypt's version of a real estate market where all the listings read, "Previous occupant died tragically," and "New tenant must accept intrusive oversight and diminished personhood." Being absorbed into extended family households was the most common outcome. Your husband's brother or father might incorporate you and your children into their existing household. This arrangement provided basic security, but subjected you to new authority structures. Therefore, you traded independence for protection, dignity for survival. The ancient Egyptian family compound had no concept of privacy settings or personal boundaries. Your grief, your parenting, your daily habits all became subject to family oversight and commentary. Families incorporated widows for practical reasons beyond simple charity. You represented valuable labor, childcare, cooking, weaving, brewing. The economic contribution of a widow's work often exceeded the cost of her maintenance. Your brother-in-law isn't being generous by taking you in. He's making a calculated investment in unpaid household labor. No employment contract, no days off, no performance reviews except constant criticism. It's the gig economy of ancient Egypt, minus the freedom to delete the app when conditions become unbearable. The physical spaces allocated to widows within family compounds spoke volumes about their status. You're given the smallest room, furthest from the central courtyard, the least desirable location, with poor ventilation and little natural light. Premium real estate was reserved for those with social standing. Your reduced circumstances are reflected in reduced square footage and reduced environmental quality. The ancient Egyptians pioneered architectural hierarchy long before modern real estate developers invented cozy as a euphemism for impossibly small. The concept of widow quarters existed in larger households, specific areas designated for dependent female relatives. These spaces functioned as both shelter and containment, keeping widows simultaneously within the family structure but separate from its main activities. It's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of the modern mother-in-law apartment, except with fewer amenities and more cultural baggage about the occupant's presumed negativity and potential contamination. Physical conditions in widow housing were typically inferior to main family accommodations. Less maintenance, fewer comforts, minimal privacy. However, these conditions were still preferable to homelessness. Consequently, most widows accepted spatial demotion without visible complaint, understanding that roof quality correlates directly with complaint privileges. The ancient Egyptian housing market offered widows two main options: substandard or none. Customer satisfaction surveys were not a feature of this arrangement. The rare widow who maintained her own home faced different challenges. Without male protection, solo-dwelling widows were vulnerable to theft, harassment, and predatory behavior from neighbors or officials. Some formed informal compounds with other single women, creating safety in numbers. These female-headed households represented radical departure from social norms and faced corresponding suspicion and scrutiny. Independent living arrangements for widows were the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a social media relationship status that reads, "It's complicated, potentially dangerous, and everyone has an unwanted opinion about it." Moving between households and communities as a widow involved navigating complex social networks. Each relocation meant renegotiating status, establishing new protections, and learning local customs. Some widows followed adult children as they established their own households, becoming incorporated as dependent grandmothers. Others moved between relatives seasonally, providing labor where most needed, a human resource shared among family branches. Geographical stability, like everything else, became a luxury widows rarely controlled. Archaeological evidence of widow living arrangements appears in subtle forms. Houses with small secondary rooms added to existing structures. Simple dwellings attached to larger family compounds. Clusters of modest homes occupied primarily by women and children. These physical traces tell stories of adaptation, dependence, and occasionally creative resilience. The archaeology of widowhood isn't marked by monumental architecture, but by the small adaptations that kept vulnerable women minimally sheltered in a society designed around male-headed households. Your first night in the storage room brings a parade of discomforts. Mice scurry along the walls, the roof leaks in one corner, your children huddle together on a mat too small for their combined bodies. But complaining would risk your tenuous welcome. Therefore, you lie awake, planning improvements. How to seal cracks, arrange sleeping space, create some semblance of dignity in quarters designed for objects rather than people. The architecture of widowhood requires developing expertise in maximizing minimal resources. Ancient Egypt's unacknowledged interior designers were likely grief-stricken women making homes from spaces never intended for human habitation. The physical conditions of widow housing directly impacted health outcomes. Poor ventilation led to respiratory problems. Dampness caused joint pain. Crowding facilitated disease transmission. The body absorbs architectural inequalities just as surely as it absorbs nutritional ones. Your chronic cough develops within weeks of relocation to the storage room. Your daughter's skin rash follows shortly after. The medical papyri contain treatments for various ailments but fail to acknowledge how living conditions create and exacerbate them. Sometimes the most effective prescription would simply be better housing, a treatment rarely available to widows. For widows with young children, housing compromises affected the entire family. Your children learn they occupy a lower tier in the household hierarchy. They eat last, sleep in the worst locations, receive the least consideration. The spatial politics of the family compound teaches lessons about social value more effectively than any explicit instruction. Your son watches his cousins claim prime sleeping spots while he's relegated to the drafty corner. Your daughter observes her aunt's children receive preference in all resource allocations. These architectural inequalities shape their understanding of their place in the world more permanently than any monument. Moving between households could happen suddenly and without warning. Your brother-in-law announces his oldest son will marry, requiring the room you've spent months adapting. You have 10 days to relocate to his cousin's home in the neighboring village. No consultation, no consideration of your children's established routines or community connections. Just another displacement in a life now defined by geographic instability. Widows developed expertise in rapid packing, efficient sorting, and emotional detachment from place. Necessary skills for those whose right to occupy space remained perpetually contingent on others' goodwill. The psychological impact of housing insecurity created a state of permanent anxiety. Each morning brings the question, will today be the day I'm told to move again? Each night, is this roof still mine tomorrow? However, many widows developed remarkable adaptability. Consequently, they created home-like environments in the most transient and unpromising spaces. The human capacity to establish belonging in hostile architectural environments might be most powerfully demonstrated by widows who transformed storage rooms into nurturing spaces for traumatized children. As the weeks pass, you transform your assigned storage room with small, meaningful improvements. A woven mat covers the worst of the floor cracks. A small oil lamp creates a center for evening activities. A cloth partition creates the illusion of privacy. These modifications represent more than practical adaptations. They're assertions of humanity in a space that defined you as less than. The architecture of resistance sometimes consists simply of refusing to live like stored property even when treated as such. Your children gradually adapt to the new sleeping arrangements, their bodies finding comfort in proximity, if not in spatial luxury. You lie awake listening to their breathing, contemplating the precariousness of your shelter. Tomorrow might bring another relocation, another reduction. But tonight, you have walls, however humble. Therefore, you find momentary peace in this imperfect sanctuary. Homelessness hovers as a constant threat for the widow without family connections or economic resources. Tonight, at least, that particular fear can rest. In ancient Egypt, a civilization that constructed eternal stone houses for the dead with mathematical precision and artistic splendor, the living arrangements provided for those most vulnerable revealed priorities more clearly than any hieroglyphic proclamation. While pharaohs dedicated massive resources to their tombs, widows navigated a landscape of architectural afterthoughts, spaces never designed for their needs, never recorded in official accounts, never celebrated in art or literature. Yet within these marginal rooms and forgotten corners, widows created something the grandest royal architects never managed to build. Homes that sustained life not through permanence or perfection, but through the daily, renewable miracle of making enough from never quite enough. Your hands bleed from grinding grain since dawn. Blisters have formed, burst and formed again on palms once soft from easier living. This is survival now, converting your labor into just enough sustenance to see tomorrow. For widows in ancient Egypt, work wasn't a career choice or personal fulfillment. It was the thin barrier between existence and starvation. You desperately need income, but society restricts what work you can perform. Therefore, you navigate a narrow channel of possibilities, accepting conditions and compensation no one else would tolerate. Welcome to the ancient Egyptian labor market for widows, where exploitation came standard and options were limited by design. Occupations available to widows fell into predictable categories, none particularly desirable or lucrative. Food production topped the list: grinding grain, brewing beer, baking bread. These essential tasks required minimal training, but consumed maximum physical energy. Therefore, many widows literally worked themselves to physical collapse, producing basic necessities for wealthier households. The ancient Egyptian economy ran on the broken bodies of women who couldn't afford to rest. Textile work offered another common path. Spinning, weaving, and mending required skills many women already possessed from household management. The work could sometimes be done alongside childcare, a critical consideration for widowed mothers. The pay was minimal, the hours extensive, and the physical toll substantial. Eye strain from detailed work by poor light, hunched backs from constant bending, fingers deformed from repetitive motion. The price of survival was often paid in chronic pain and progressive disability. Ancient Egypt had no ergonomic assessments or workers' compensation, just the relentless mathematics of production requirements versus physical limitations. Skills and trades widows could practice depended partly on what they'd learned during marriage. A potter's widow might continue his work if she'd assisted him. A merchant's widow might maintain some trading contacts, but these transitions rarely proceeded smoothly. Therefore, most widows found themselves downgraded to less skilled and less valued occupations, regardless of their actual capabilities. It's the ancient Egyptian version of having your LinkedIn profile automatically demoted upon your husband's death, with all your professional endorsements suddenly questioning your competence. The economic value of widow labor was paradoxical, simultaneously essential and devalued. Widows performed critical functions in food production, textile creation, and household maintenance. Yet this labor commanded the lowest possible compensation precisely because it was performed by women with minimal bargaining power. Supply and demand applied brutally when the supply consisted of desperate women, and the demand came from those exploiting that desperation. No union representation, no minimum wage laws, not even the pretense of fair compensation for necessary work. Ancient Egyptian widows essentially invented the concept of being both essential workers and dramatically underpaid, a tradition that unfortunately continues in many sectors today. Working within the household versus public work presented different challenges and benefits. Domestic labor for extended family offered some protection from harassment, but often meant working for room and board alone, with no actual currency changing hands. Public work might pay slightly better, but exposed widows to danger, judgment, and social stigma. Therefore, each option required weighing impossible trade-offs between basic security and bare subsistence. The phrase choosing between a rock and a hard place doesn't quite capture it. It was more like choosing between a crushing boulder and a pit of crocodiles, while someone helpfully reminded you to be grateful for having choices at all. Begging and charity became necessary survival mechanisms for widows who couldn't secure sufficient work or family support. Temple doorways and marketplaces became gathering spots for women whose bodies had failed them after years of brutal labor. The social safety net consisted entirely of inconsistent religious charity and individual generosity, both subject to fluctuation based on harvests, politics, and public mood. Imagine a retirement plan that consists entirely of hoping strangers feel generous today. That was the economic security system for elderly widows who could no longer work. How widows bartered and traded to survive reveals remarkable ingenuity under constraint. Without currency, many operated in complex webs of favor exchange and resource sharing. Your neighbor watches your children while you grind grain. In exchange, you repair her clothing. She trades some of her bread for medicine from the herbalist, then shares a portion with you when your child falls ill. These intricate networks of mutual aid operated beneath the formal economy, creating survival possibilities where the official system provided none. Ancient Egyptian widows pioneered the sharing economy millennia before Silicon Valley venture capitalists claimed to invent it, and did it without extracting massive profits or requiring smartphone apps. Some widows developed specialized niches in the shadow economy: midwifery, healing, hairdressing, cosmetic preparation, services primarily for women, often operating through word of mouth rather than formal business structures. These occupations carried risks. Healing failures could be attributed to malicious magic rather than medical limitations. Midwifery complications could result in accusations of incompetence or worse, but such work often paid better than physical labor. Therefore, some widows gambled on these higher-risk, higher-reward occupations, despite the dangers. Risk assessment looks very different when all available options involve substantial danger. Collective support among widows created crucial survival mechanisms. Records and archaeological evidence suggest widows sometimes formed joint households, sharing childcare, pooling resources, and protecting each other. These arrangements weren't just economic. They provided emotional support and practical assistance during illness or crisis. The widow houses that occasionally appear in records represent ancient Egypt's unacknowledged innovation in cooperative living and mutual aid. No one designed these arrangements from above. They emerged organically from women creating solutions when systems failed them. Entrepreneurial widows who created successful livelihoods existed but were exceptional. A brewery operated by 3 widows who combined their knowledge and resources. A widow who specialized in high-quality linen production, eventually employing other women. These success stories required unusual combinations of skill, opportunity, connections, and luck. They're worth noting precisely because they were so rare, exceptions that highlight the overwhelming pattern of economic marginalization. For every widow who established a sustainable business, hundreds or thousands struggled in grinding poverty despite working from dawn until collapse. The physical toll of widow labor appears in skeletal remains from ancient Egypt. Bone analysis reveals patterns of repetitive stress, premature arthritis, and injuries consistent with constant heavy labor. Remains of older women show vertebrae compressed from years of grinding grain, carrying water, and bending over work. The archaeology of widow labor is written in calcium and collagen, bodies shaped by survival requirements that exceeded human physical capacity but had to be met regardless. These women literally worked themselves to death, their bones testifying to lives spent pushing human endurance beyond its limits simply to exist another day. Your child falls ill during your 2nd month of widowhood. You cannot stop working to provide proper care, but you cannot leave a suffering child alone. Therefore, you carry her on your back while grinding grain, her feverish body adding weight to your already exhausting task. The impossible mathematics of widow survival often force choices between competing essential needs: income versus childcare, rest versus production, today's food versus tomorrow's security. No good solutions existed, only different variations of inadequate compromises. As weeks turn to months, your body adapts to its new demands, though not without cost. Calluses replace blisters on your hands. Muscles accustomed to household work reshape for constant grinding, lifting, carrying. Pain becomes background noise rather than emergency signal. You learn to work through exhaustion, illness, injury. Luxuries of rest exist only for those with security margins you no longer possess. Your physical capacity becomes your only reliable asset, and you spend it like currency, knowing it's a non-renewable resource depleting with each passing day. With your first independent earnings, 3 copper pieces for 2 weeks of grinding, comes a moment of fierce pride. The coins are painfully insufficient for your needs, but they represent something beyond their economic value. Therefore, you hold them briefly before spending them on necessities, allowing yourself to momentarily savor the dignity of earned income. Survival creates a strange recalibration of what constitutes victory. In the realm of widow economics, simply continuing to exist becomes an achievement worth acknowledging. Some widows found unexpected strength in their economic struggles. Skills developed, confidence built, capabilities discovered only when necessity demanded them. This isn't to romanticize suffering or suggest hardship was somehow beneficial. It wasn't. It was brutal, unfair, and destructive. But human resilience sometimes manifests most powerfully precisely when systems are most oppressive. The quiet revolution of widows who refused economic extinction, despite systems designed to ensure it, represents an unwritten chapter of resistance in ancient Egyptian history. As another workday ends, you soak your bleeding hands in cool water, knowing tomorrow brings the same labor, the same pain, the same insufficient compensation. Your children sleep nearby. They're breathing the metronome that measures your purpose. They're fed today because your body endured what bodies shouldn't have to endure. Tomorrow demands the same sacrifice. You'll make it again and again, for as long as your flesh allows. Not because you're heroic, but because the alternative is unthinkable. The sun rises on another day of widow labor. You rise with it, moving carefully to avoid waking your children, trying not to disturb muscles that never fully recover before the next day's demands. Your hands reach automatically for the grinding stone that has become both your salvation and your torment. There's a rhythm to survival, predictable, relentless, necessary. No days off, no recognition, no alternative. In the magnificent tombs of ancient Egypt, wall paintings glorified the work that sustained civilization: farming, crafting, building. But the artists never depicted the widow hunched over her grinding stone for 12 hours straight, her children working alongside her as soon as they could lift tools, her body consuming itself to produce just enough to prevent starvation for one more day. Perhaps the most essential labor in Egypt was precisely the work deemed too common, too desperate, too female to memorialize in art or record in official histories. The daily, invisible work of widows who kept the machinery of survival functioning without recognition, without rest, and without the luxury of ever being able to stop. Gold glints on her wrists as she commands servants with a gesture. The royal widow moves through the palace corridors, her status evident in every step. Elite widows, queens, nobles, and the wealthy inhabited a different universe from their common counterparts. Their gilded grief came with privileges, but even golden cages remain cages. Therefore, the elite widow navigated a complex landscape of political intrigue, dynastic obligation, and constrained power. Her tears might fall on linen rather than mud, but they fell nonetheless. The unique position of royal widows created both opportunity and danger. As a queen whose king had died, you possessed knowledge, connections, and potential influence. But without your husband's protection, rivals saw you as either threat or asset. Therefore, you faced immediate pressure to align with power blocks or risk elimination, sometimes literally. Royal widowhood was ancient Egypt's most high-stakes chess game, except the losing pieces weren't simply removed from the board. They were often removed from existence. Power dynamics in royal succession placed queen widows in precarious positions that varied with circumstance. If your son was the new pharaoh, you might ascend to the powerful position of king's mother, potentially wielding substantial influence. If a rival claimed the throne, you might find yourself exiled, imprisoned, or conveniently forgotten in a distant palace. Your survival depended less on your own qualities and more on your strategic value to others. Ancient Egypt's royal version of, "It's not personal, it's politics," though the consequences were intensely personal for those on the losing side. Examples of influential queen widows dot Egyptian history like rare jewels, exceptions that prove the rule of female constraint. Ahmose Nefertari, widow of Ahmose I, who secured unprecedented religious and economic powers. Hatshepsut, who transformed widowhood into a launchpad for her own rule as pharaoh. These women didn't just adapt to widowhood, they reconstructed it into a platform for power. They were the ancient Egyptian equivalent of taking lemons and making not just lemonade, but a thriving beverage empire, complete with international distribution. The elite widow's appearance maintained rigorous standards despite her grief. While common widows wore simple mourning garb, noble widows balanced visible grief with status signaling. The appropriate display of mourning jewelry, specific hairstyles, and regulated cosmetics all communicated her precise position in the hierarchy of elite bereavement. Imagine a Vogue magazine spread titled, "This Season's Mourning Trends for the Discerning Widow," complete with accessory recommendations and warnings about fashion faux pas that might suggest either insufficient grief or unseemly emotional excess. Noble widows enjoyed relative privileges compared to common women in similar circumstances. Their economic cushion, properties, servants, stored wealth, provided security unavailable to ordinary widows. But these privileges came with intensified scrutiny. Therefore, elite widows traded financial stability for diminished personal freedom. Every choice, from mourning practices to potential remarriage, underwent evaluation by court society and extended family networks. The ancient Egyptian elite created history's first version of celebrity gossip, focusing intensely on widows whose behavior might affect dynastic politics or property transfers. Political marriages after widowhood represented strategic realignments rather than personal choices. Your preferences mattered far less than your political value. Royal widows particularly faced remarriage as diplomatic currency, useful for cementing alliances, preventing conflicts, or securing loyalties. Love was irrelevant. Compatibility was optional. Dynastic advantage was essential. Dating profiles for elite widows would have listed politically advantageous family connections and fertile with proven history of producing male heirs, long before personality traits or personal interests. The use of widowhood as a political tool appears throughout Egyptian history. A powerful man might marry a predecessor's widow to strengthen his claim to authority. Foreign rulers sought Egyptian royal widows to create legitimacy through association. Ambitious families pushed widowed daughters into strategic marriages to advance their influence. These women became living chess pieces, moved across the political board by others pursuing power. The ancient Egyptian court made Game of Thrones look almost restrained in its political manipulation, minus the dragons, but with equally lethal intrigue. Elite widows maintained influence primarily through children, particularly sons in positions of power. A widow whose son controlled wealth or authority gained significant protection and potential influence. But this created unhealthy dependency on children who might have their own agendas. Therefore, mother-son relationships often became complicated webs of mutual use, obligation, and occasional resentment. The politics of the royal nursery eventually became the politics of the kingdom, with childhood dynamics playing out on national scales once those children gained power. The physical environment of elite widowhood dramatically contrasted with common experience. Instead of being relegated to storage rooms, noble widows often received dedicated quarters in family compounds or palace complexes. These widow wings provided comfort and appropriate dignity, but also created convenient separation from centers of power. Therefore, many elite widows found themselves comfortably isolated, physically well-maintained, but strategically sidelined. Think of it as ancient Egypt's version of a luxury retirement community with excellent amenities but strict restrictions on visitors, communications, and independent decision-making. Even powerful widows faced constraints unimaginable to their male counterparts. Ahotep, who may have led military campaigns during her son's minority, never received the formal recognition a male regent would have claimed. Nefertari, beloved wife of Ramesses II, saw her influence diminish dramatically after his death, despite her previous prominence. The temporary nature of female power became particularly evident in widowhood, allowed in exceptional circumstances, but quickly reclaimed by male structures once the exception passed. It's like being permitted to drive only during emergencies, then having the keys permanently confiscated once the crisis resolves. Archaeological evidence of elite widowhood appears in tomb arrangements, property documents, and palace records. Some queens maintained separate funerary complexes, rather than being buried with husbands. Others disappeared from historical records immediately after their husbands' deaths, their own fates unrecorded and apparently unimportant once their primary role ended. The archaeological invisibility of even royal widows speaks volumes about their contingent value, important as wives and mothers, often irrelevant once those roles concluded. The emotional reality behind elite widows' gilded existence rarely appears in official records. Hieroglyphs don't record tears, loneliness, or frustrated ambition. But private correspondence occasionally reveals glimpses of genuine grief beneath political maneuvering. Therefore, we can surmise that wealth and status provided material comfort, but not emotional insulation. Gold anklets and linen sheets don't prevent heartbreak, though they arguably make the crying more comfortable. Even queens learned that status couldn't protect the heart, only the body. For an elite widow, maintaining appearance and dignity required constant vigilance. A single misstep could threaten carefully cultivated position. Showing too much ambition might trigger suspicion. Displaying too little competence could invite exploitation. The balance required political genius, emotional intelligence, and flawless public performance. It's like walking a tightrope while juggling diplomatic relations, family politics, and personal grief, all while wearing an uncomfortable crown and making it look effortless. Some elite widows found unexpected freedom in their state. Freed from direct male oversight while retaining financial resources, these exceptional women sometimes pursued interests previously denied them. Archaeological evidence suggests widowed noblewomen occasionally commissioned their own building projects, influenced religious practices, or patronized arts. These rare examples of widow agency emerged not from the system's design, but from its occasional failure to fully constrain exceptional women with unusual resources and determination. As months pass in your life as an ordinary widow, you glimpse a noble funeral procession passing through the village. The widow rides in a curtained litter, her mourning garments finer than anything you'll ever touch. For a moment, you envy her material comfort, her protection from grinding physical labor. But you notice the guards surrounding her, the advisors monitoring her every movement. Therefore, you realize her gilded cage may be as confining as your poverty, different prisons, both designed by the same system. You return to your grinding stone, your calloused hands, your daily struggle for survival. The noble widow returns to her palace intrigues and political constraints. Between these extremes existed countless gradations of widow experience: merchant widows, scribe widows, artisan widows, each navigating their specific combination of restriction and possibility. The details varied, but the fundamental reality remained constant across social boundaries. The ancient Egyptians, who meticulously categorized everything from spices to stars, created equally precise hierarchies of widow value and treatment. They built a society where a queen widow might control vast resources while a peasant widow starved, where gold adorned some grieving wrists while calluses covered others. Yet perhaps the most revealing truth about this civilization wasn't the distance between these experiences, but their underlying similarity. For regardless of whether a widow's tears fell on alabaster or mud, they all flowed from the same fundamental realization that in a world built by and for men, even the most privileged woman remained ultimately a guest whose welcome could expire with her husband's last breath. A Mesopotamian clay tablet records a widow's desperate plea for justice. In Athens, a veiled widow sits confined to her male guardian's home. Across the ancient world, widows inhabited uniquely vulnerable positions. But Egyptian widows faced distinct challenges shaped by their culture's particular contradictions. Therefore, comparing widow experiences across civilizations reveals both universal patterns and illuminating differences. The geography of grief varied dramatically, depending on which ancient soil a woman stood upon when her husband drew his final breath. Egyptian widows' experiences contrasted sharply with those in neighboring Mesopotamia, where more formalized legal protections sometimes existed. Babylonian and Assyrian law codes explicitly addressed widow rights, offering at least theoretical protection. But these protections often remained aspirational rather than practical. Therefore, both societies ultimately failed their widows, just through different mechanisms. Egypt through ambiguity and social pressure. Mesopotamia through the gap between written law and actual practice. It's like comparing two inadequate insurance policies, one that promises coverage but denies claims, versus one that never promised much to begin with. Either way, the widow ends up unprotected. Greek widow practices created even harsher constraints than those in Egypt. In Athens, widows returned to the guardianship of male relatives as if their brief taste of adult status during marriage needed to be quickly revoked. They lived under stricter seclusion, with severely limited public appearances and economic activities. By comparison, Egyptian widows enjoyed marginally greater mobility and economic possibility, though better than Athens represents an exceptionally low bar, rather like saying this particular dungeon has slightly larger windows than the one next door. Technically accurate, but hardly cause for celebration. Roman widows experienced somewhat more favorable conditions, particularly if they were wealthy. The concept of univira, the one-man woman who remained devoted to her deceased husband, carried social prestige, but this ideal primarily served male interests by keeping inherited wealth concentrated. Therefore, even this seemingly positive status came with implicit control mechanisms. Roman society didn't offer widows freedom so much as a more comfortable, prestigious form of constraint, the ancient equivalent of a luxury prison with excellent amenities, but still very much a prison. Changes in widow treatment across different Egyptian dynasties reflected broader social and political shifts. Old Kingdom records suggest more restrictive practices, with widows almost invisible in official documentation. Middle Kingdom sources reveal slightly improved status, with occasional property rights acknowledged. New Kingdom records include more examples of widow autonomy, though still severely limited. Each era adjusted widow treatment based on prevailing religious interpretations, economic conditions, and political structures. The evolution wasn't linear progress, so much as variations on the same theme of systematic disadvantage, like fashion trends in oppression, where the basic design remains consistent while the accessories change seasonally. The influence of foreign rule brought significant changes to widow customs in later Egyptian history. Persian administration introduced different legal frameworks. Greek Ptolemaic rule imported Hellenic concepts of guardianship, but also expanded some property rights. Roman oversight imposed yet another layer of legal complexity. These transitions created confusion, but also occasional opportunities for widows who could navigate multiple overlapping systems. Some savvy widows exploited contradictions between Egyptian traditional practices and foreign legal structures, perhaps history's first example of regulatory arbitrage, though without the massive financial incentives or expensive consultants. One striking similarity across ancient cultures was the economic vulnerability of widows, regardless of specific legal frameworks. Whether in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, or Rome, widowhood typically meant immediate economic precarity. The universal nature of this pattern reveals how deeply patriarchal economic control transcended cultural differences. Civilizations that fought wars over territorial and ideological differences somehow managed perfect consensus on keeping widows economically dependent. It's perhaps the ancient world's most successful example of cross-cultural agreement. A pity it concerned systematic disempowerment rather than something more beneficial. Religious differences significantly affected widow experiences across cultures. Mesopotamian temple complexes sometimes provided economic opportunities for widows as cult functionaries. Greek religious practices largely excluded widows from public ceremonies. Egyptian temples occasionally offered both employment and charity for widows, though inconsistently. These variations meant that a widow's access to divine support, both spiritual and material, depended heavily on which gods her culture happened to worship. The divine marketplace offered dramatically different services for widows, depending on geographical location, proof that even the gods had regional policies regarding women's support systems. Documentary evidence reveals fascinating cross-cultural exchanges of widow practices. Papyri from Greek-controlled Egypt show widows strategically employing either Egyptian or Greek legal concepts, depending on which better served their interests. Legal records from Roman Egypt demonstrate similar flexibility, with widows occasionally citing older Egyptian traditions when Roman law disadvantaged them. These adaptive strategies required remarkable knowledge and savvy. While men wrote the official laws, clever widows sometimes exploited the spaces between competing legal frameworks, ancient Egypt's version of finding loopholes in the fine print, though the stakes involved survival rather than tax advantages. The emotional experience of widowhood likely transcended cultural differences in many ways. Grief, fear, and adjustment to unwanted new status would have created similar psychological challenges, regardless of specific cultural practices. But each society's mourning rituals shaped how these emotions could be expressed. Therefore, Egyptian widows, with their elaborate mourning periods and specific behavioral codes, processed grief through distinctly different cultural pathways than their counterparts elsewhere. The universal pain of loss was filtered through highly specific cultural templates, like different languages expressing the same emotion, but with untranslatable nuances. Archaeological evidence offers particularly valuable cross-cultural insights. Burial practices in Egypt, where widows were rarely entombed with their husbands, contrasted with Mesopotamian practices where joint burials sometimes occurred. Material culture, the objects associated with widows in different societies, reveals economic disparities. Egyptian widow housing arrangements, sometimes visible in archaeological remains, differed from Greek practices of reabsorbing widows into paternal households. These material traces tell stories that written records often omit, the archaeology of absence revealing what official narratives tried to erase. The unique aspects of Egyptian widowhood, compared to neighbors, included more permeable boundaries between social classes, relatively greater religious involvement for widows, and somewhat more economic flexibility despite severe constraints. However, these marginal advantages didn't fundamentally alter the underlying vulnerability. Consequently, Egyptian widows faced challenges distinct in detail, but similar in essence, to those experienced by women across the ancient world. It's like comparing different models of the same fundamentally flawed vehicle. They might have slightly different features, but none of them actually work very well. How religious shifts affected widow treatment over time represents a particularly fascinating pattern. As Egyptian religion evolved through contact with other cultures, widow practices adapted accordingly. When Greek Serapis worship blended with traditional Egyptian Osiris worship during the Ptolemaic period, widow ritual participation changed subtly. When Christianity eventually gained influence, widow treatment transformed more dramatically, with Christian communities sometimes providing greater support systems. Religious change offered rare moments when established patterns might be disrupted, creating both danger and opportunity for women navigating bereavement across shifting spiritual landscapes. Lasting legacies of ancient attitudes toward widows persisted far beyond antiquity. Medieval widow practices, Victorian mourning customs, and even modern inheritance laws bear imprints of these ancient patterns. Egyptian widow experiences represented one cultural variation on universal themes of female vulnerability, economic marginalization, and social control. The fundamental assumption that widows represented a problem requiring management rather than people deserving support transcended both geographical boundaries and the passage of centuries. Ancient Egyptian widows would sadly recognize much in how their modern counterparts are still viewed in many societies. As you grind grain in your brother-in-law's household, 3 months into widowhood, a merchant from Babylon passes through your village. He describes widows in his homeland, their distinct clothing, different legal status, alternative mourning practices. But despite these exotic variations, you recognize the fundamental similarity in their circumstances. Therefore, you feel a strange connection across boundaries to women you'll never meet, united by shared vulnerability despite cultural differences. The geography and language may change, but the essential mathematics of widow survival remains eerily consistent. The merchant mentions a Babylonian widow who successfully maintained her husband's trading business, another who secured unusual legal protections through temple connections. These rare success stories travel between cultures like precious artifacts, offering fragile hope that the overwhelming pattern might occasionally be broken. You store these narratives carefully in memory, adding them to your collection of strategies and possibilities gleaned from watchful observation of other widows in your community. Looking across the landscape of ancient civilizations reveals that widows everywhere navigated terrain designed to limit their movement, voices, and autonomy. What varied wasn't whether constraints existed, but precisely how they were constructed, justified, and occasionally circumvented. Egyptian widows faced unique combinations of religious obligation, economic vulnerability, and social marginalization shaped by Nile Valley cultural particulars. Their Mesopotamian, Greek, or Roman counterparts encountered different obstacles arranged in different patterns, but leading to remarkably similar destinations. Throughout the ancient world, from the ziggurats of Ur to the temples of Thebes, from Athens' Agora to Rome's Forum, civilizations that fiercely disagreed about territory, trade, and theology somehow reached perfect consensus on one principle: that women who had lost their husbands represented not victims deserving protection, but problems requiring control. This silent agreement across otherwise hostile cultures speaks more truthfully about ancient priorities than any monument or inscription, revealing that beneath their cultural differences, these societies shared a common architectural feature built into their very foundations: the systematic conversion of personal tragedy into social containment, with widows serving as both the raw material and the finished product of this ruthlessly efficient process. She refuses to marry her brother-in-law. The family threatens, cajoles, pressures. She stands firm. This widow has chosen resistance over surrender, exercising the most dangerous power available to her, the power to say no. For every 1,000 Egyptian widows who submitted to societal expectations, a few remarkable women found ways to exercise control despite overwhelming constraints. Their resistance wasn't loud or revolutionary, but it was persistent and creative. Therefore, these small rebellions created tiny cracks in the monolithic structures of patriarchal control. While history recorded the grand achievements of pharaohs, these unwritten acts of widow defiance represent a shadow history of quiet rebellion worth examining. How widows found ways to exercise control reveals remarkable ingenuity under constraint. False compliance masked private resistance. Apparent acceptance concealed careful manipulation of circumstances. Playing powerful men against each other created protected spaces for limited autonomy. These strategies required psychological sophistication far beyond the capabilities society attributed to simple women. The ancient Egyptian widow who successfully navigated these treacherous waters wasn't just surviving. She was demonstrating a form of genius rarely recognized by historians who preferred recording battles to documenting the complex wars of daily resistance. Examples of widows who challenged social norms appear in fragmentary records and archaeological evidence. The widow who refused remarriage, despite intense family pressure, choosing to join a female-led weaving collective instead. Another who manipulated religious obligations to avoid an unwanted second marriage, claiming her deceased husband's spirit required her exclusive ritual attention. These women weren't documented as rebels. They simply appear as anomalies in records designed to track conformity. Their resistance is visible only in the negative space, the administrative equivalent of shadows on papyrus. Legal strategies used by clever widows demonstrate remarkable understanding of systems designed to exclude them. Some partnered with sympathetic male relatives to create proxy control over resources. Others exploited contradictions between religious and civil authorities. A few leveraged foreign cultural practices during periods of changing dynastic influence. The most successful combined multiple approaches, creating customized resistance frameworks suited to their specific circumstances. These widows were essentially practicing law without license, recognition, or training, yet developing sophisticated strategies that sometimes outmaneuvered formally educated male opponents. Communities of widows supporting each other created perhaps the most significant resistance mechanism. Widow houses, shared living arrangements among women without men, appear occasionally in records and archaeological evidence. These arrangements provided economic efficiency, but also offered mutual protection and emotional support. Therefore, they represented both practical survival strategy and implicit rejection of the requirement for male oversight. Imagine ancient Egypt's version of a women's collective, minus the consciousness-raising sessions, and plus a lot more grain grinding. Proto-feminist spaces, carved out through necessity rather than ideology. Widow-led households that succeeded against odds often relied on creative economic arrangements. Some formed production cooperatives, pooling labor and resources to create marketable goods like textiles or processed foods. Others developed specialized services requiring minimal capital investment, midwifery, hair care, childcare. These entrepreneurial approaches worked within accepted female domains, but transformed them into sources of independent sustenance. Therefore, traditional women's work became a Trojan horse containing the dangerous possibility of female economic autonomy. These widows didn't have business degrees or startup funding, but they invented sustainable micro-enterprises millennia before Muhammad Yunus got his Nobel Prize. The power of widows as keepers of family history and knowledge created another subtle form of agency. Older widows especially became repositories of genealogical information, traditional practices, and community memory. This knowledge gave them soft power within family structures, otherwise dominated by male authority. The widow who could trace bloodlines back 5 generations, or who remembered the details of land boundaries from decades past, possessed information others needed. Information has always been currency, even before the digital age made this explicit. Ancient Egyptian widows who controlled crucial family data wielded influence invisible in official power structures, but quite real in practice. Evidence from letters, artifacts, and records showing widow autonomy requires careful interpretation. Official documents rarely record female independence directly, but material remains sometimes tell different stories. Therefore, archaeologists find occasional widow households with unexpected wealth indicators, business records showing female management, or burial arrangements suggesting autonomy. These material traces speak when written records remain silent. A widow's seal used on business documents. A home modified for female-only occupation. grave goods indicating wealth independently controlled. These physical remnants reveal lives lived partially outside prescribed boundaries. The untold stories of widow resilience and adaptation represent history's negative space, defined by what surrounds them rather than direct documentation. We glimpse them through anomalies in property records, unusual burial arrangements, or confused scribal notes about irregular household arrangements. They appear in the archaeological record as unexplained variations from expected patterns. The most successful widow resistance likely left the least evidence, precisely because it avoided direct confrontation with authority. The absence of conflict in the record may indicate not compliance, but strategic circumvention too effective to trigger official notice. Some widows leveraged their very marginalization as a form of freedom. If society already viewed you as somewhat dangerous and contaminated by death, why not use that perception strategically? Records mention widows who cultivated slightly frightening reputations, using superstitious fears to create bubbles of autonomy within which they could operate with less interference. It's the ancient Egyptian version of, if they're going to call you a witch anyway, you might as well enjoy the discounts on broomsticks. The social stigma of widowhood occasionally transformed from liability into asset through creative repurposing. Religious authority sometimes provided unlikely avenues for widow agency. Certain temple positions, professional mourners, ritual specialists, sanctuary attendants, offered widows rare legitimate public roles. These positions remained constrained, but provided economic support and social standing. Therefore, some widows cultivated religious connections specifically to access these protected spaces. While male priests controlled formal religious power, widows operating in temple peripheries created niches of limited autonomy. Sometimes the most effective resistance happens not by opposing systems, but by finding their blind spots and quietly expanding them from within. Comparative evidence suggests Egyptian widows may have had marginally more maneuvering room than contemporaries in some neighboring societies. Greek widows faced stricter seclusion. Mesopotamian widows encountered more rigid legal structures. This slightly greater flexibility, combined with Egypt's relatively complex economy, created conditional possibilities for exceptional women to exercise limited agency. Not freedom by any modern definition, but perhaps enough space to occasionally choose between constrained options rather than simply accepting a predetermined path. After 6 months of widowhood, you make a small but significant decision. Instead of accepting your brother-in-law's latest marriage pressure, you negotiate a different arrangement, maintaining a separate household while providing textile labor for his workshop. The terms are far from equal. The work is exhausting, but this arrangement preserves some minimal autonomy. Therefore, you count it as a victory, though no one else would recognize it as such. This is how widow resistance typically looked. Not grand rebellions, but tiny expansions of constricted possibility through persistent negotiation and strategic compromise. You notice other widows in your community employing similar strategies. The subtle cooperation when one faces particular pressure. The shared childcare that enables specialized work development. The careful information exchange about which officials might be more sympathetic to widow concerns. None of this appears in official records. No papyrus documents these quiet collaborations. But you recognize them as the invisible infrastructure of survival for women like yourself, a parallel system operating beneath the formal structures of society. The tools of widow resistance were rarely dramatic. Patience, persistence, careful observation, strategic timing, selective compliance, and judicious alliance building. These weapons left no archaeological trace, recorded no victories on temple walls, inspired no commemorative scarabs, but they enabled something remarkable: the survival and occasional flourishing of women in a system explicitly designed to contain and control them. The fact that widows existed at all, rather than perishing immediately after their husbands, testifies to their extraordinary resilience and adaptive intelligence. Throughout Egyptian history, from Old Kingdom to Roman period, the fundamental reality remained consistent. Widows faced systemic disadvantages designed to limit their autonomy and channel their existence into narrowly prescribed paths. Yet within these severe constraints, countless unnamed women found ways to expand their constricted spaces, protect their children, maintain dignity, and occasionally create lives with meaning beyond mere survival. Their resistance wasn't recorded by scribes or celebrated in art. It exists in the negative space of the historical record, visible primarily through the shadows it cast and the anomalies it created in a system that preferred its widows compliant, invisible, and neatly categorized. Perhaps the most profound form of widow agency in ancient Egypt wasn't found in the exceptional cases of those who secured unusual wealth or influence, but in the daily, unrecorded resistance of ordinary women who refused to be reduced to the circumstances imposed upon them, who maintained their full humanity in a system that offered them only partial personhood, who created meaning from marginality, and who passed to their daughters not just strategies for survival, but the revolutionary knowledge that even within the narrowest constraints, choice remains possible and dignity worth defending. The sun sets over the Nile as it has for millennia, indifferent to the countless widow tears that have mingled with its waters. We've walked through the shadow-filled world of Egyptian widows, women whose stories history recorded primarily through their absence. Their experiences reveal more about ancient Egypt than any golden mask or towering monument ever could, but these women left few direct records of their struggles. Therefore, we must piece together their reality from fragments, implications, and the negative spaces in historical documents. What emerges is a portrait of extraordinary resilience against systematic erasure, a testament to human endurance that deserves recognition after thousands of years of silence. The unwritten experiences of countless Egyptian widows compose an invisible history running parallel to the grand narratives of pharaohs and priests. While men carved their accomplishments into stone expecting immortality, widows fought daily battles for basic existence with no expectation of remembrance. Yet paradoxically, their anonymous struggles may speak more truthfully about Egyptian civilization than any self-aggrandizing royal inscription. The monuments celebrate ideals and aspirations. The widow experience reveals actual values and priorities. Egypt's treatment of its most vulnerable members provides a more honest assessment of its moral architecture than its most impressive temples. How studying widows reveals the true structure of ancient societies offers a vital corrective to history focused exclusively on the powerful. Social hierarchies become visible in their starkest form when examined from below rather than above. The widow, stripped of protection, resource access, and often basic dignity, shows us where the weight of Egyptian social organization ultimately rested. Like examining a building's foundation rather than its decorative facade, understanding widow experiences reveals the underlying design principles of the entire social structure. It turns out ancient Egypt's impressive civilization was built on a foundation of disposable women, an architectural detail the tourism board brochures conveniently omit. What makes the widow experience particularly valuable for understanding ancient Egypt is precisely its ordinariness. Most Egyptian women would become widows if they lived long enough. This wasn't an exceptional circumstance, but an expected life phase for which society had developed specific containment mechanisms. However, these mechanisms prioritized social stability over individual welfare. Consequently, widow management systems reveal core values more clearly than exceptional circumstances ever could. It's like judging a restaurant not by the special occasion dinner, but by its everyday lunch service. The routine reveals true priorities more honestly than the exceptional. The invisibility of widows in much of recorded history creates methodological challenges for modern researchers. We glimpse them primarily through legal documents that restricted them, administrative records that categorized them, or religious texts that prescribed their behavior. But these sources reveal more about societal attempts to control widows than about widow experiences themselves. Therefore, we must read against the grain looking for evidence of agency in documents designed to record compliance. It's historical detective work requiring both scholarly rigor and empathetic imagination, using the footprints to reconstruct the walker when no direct image exists. How do we find these invisible women? Archaeological evidence provides some pathways: distinctive household arrangements, burial patterns suggesting reduced resources, occupational markers indicating widow-associated professions. Material culture speaks when written records remain silent. The grinding stones worn thin from desperate use. The modest grave goods of women buried without male family markers. The clustering of female-operated looms in certain household areas. These physical traces tell stories of adaptation and survival more eloquently than many texts, though interpreting them requires careful contextual understanding. The legacy of ancient Egyptian widowhood practices echoes through subsequent cultures in ways rarely acknowledged. When medieval Europe developed its complex widow regulations, it built upon foundations established millennia earlier. When Victorian society created elaborate mourning rituals and restrictions for widows, it echoed ancient Egyptian concerns about containing grief and female independence. Even modern inheritance laws that disadvantage widows in various cultures carry traces of ancient anxiety about women operating outside male oversight. These historical echoes remind us that patriarchal control systems possess remarkable durability and adaptability across vastly different cultural contexts. Apparently restricting widow autonomy is a cultural technology with impressive backward compatibility across operating systems. What modern readers can learn from these forgotten women extends beyond historical understanding. Their experiences reveal uncomfortable parallels with contemporary treatment of vulnerable populations. The systems justifying their marginalization, appeals to tradition, religious authority, economic necessity, and natural gender roles, remain remarkably familiar in current discourse about various disadvantaged groups. However, their resistance strategies also offer inspiration. Consequently, studying ancient widow adaptation provides insights into human resilience relevant to modern circumstances. Ancient Egyptian widows didn't have social media hashtag campaigns or non-profit advocacy organizations, but they developed sophisticated survival networks that modern community organizers might recognize. Perhaps most importantly, these women's stories remind us that history isn't just what gets recorded in official documents. It's also the daily struggle of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, people whose names may be lost, but whose collective experience shaped the world we inherited. The widow grinding grain for 12 hours a day to feed her children contributed as much to Egyptian civilization as the pharaoh commissioning his monumental tomb, though only one of them got their name carved in stone. Historical justice requires acknowledging both contributions. The emotional realities these women faced, grief complicated by economic desperation, social marginalization, and relentless pressure to remarry, transcend their specific historical context. Human emotional responses to loss remain remarkably consistent across millennia, though cultural expressions vary dramatically. Egyptian widows couldn't post about their grief journey on Instagram or join support groups, but their fundamental emotional experiences would be recognizable to modern widows. The universality of certain human experiences creates bridges across time more durable than any physical monument. As our journey through the world of ancient Egyptian widows concludes, we're left with fragmentary glimpses rather than complete portraits. We've seen the economic precipice they faced, the legal mazes they navigated, the social stigmas they endured, and the remarkable adaptations they developed. Their stories comprise a shadow history of ancient Egypt, not the Egypt of gold masks and colossal statues, but of grinding stones and calloused hands. Not the Egypt celebrated in triumphant inscriptions, but the one experienced by ordinary women facing extraordinary challenges. If you find yourself in a museum gazing at Egyptian artifacts, take a moment to look beyond the spectacular treasures of kings. Try to see the invisible women whose labor, compliance, and occasional resistance made that civilization possible. The widow who wove the linen, the widow who ground the grain, the widow who raised the workers who built the monuments. Their contributions remain largely anonymous, but their collective impact was immeasurable. Therefore, our understanding of ancient Egypt remains incomplete until we acknowledge these shadow lives that sustained its visible glories. Perhaps you're drifting towards sleep now, the challenges of ancient Egyptian widows fading into dreams. Before you go, remember this. For every pharaoh whose name we still speak, thousands of nameless widows lived, struggled, adapted, and endured in circumstances designed to erase them. Their resilience, despite systematic disadvantage, represents a form of strength more impressive than any military conquest or architectural achievement. We may not know their individual names, but in honoring their collective experience, we recognize a profound truth: that history's most consequential participants are often found not on thrones or battlefield command posts, but in the quiet corners where ordinary people face extraordinary challenges with nothing but courage, creativity, and the unshakable determination to endure.